The wind over the Adriatic carries the smell of salt and stone. It moves across the rugged mountains of the Balkans, slips through narrow valleys, and brushes the dark waters of ancient lakes. Long before the word Albania was spoken, before borders were drawn, before flags rose and fell, there was a land of cliffs and shepherd fires. A land where survival was not granted, it was earned. This is where our story begins, not with a king, not with a battle, but with a people. In the beginning, before history had ink, there were tribes. They lived between the shimmering coast of the Adriatic and the jagged spine of mountains that still define the country today. They were not yet Albanians. They were known as the Illyrians, a mosaic of warrior clans spread across the Western Balkans. To outsiders, they were fierce, unpredictable, and free. The Illyrians did not leave behind libraries. They left behind stone fortresses, burial mounds, weapons, and the faint echo of their language. They were cattle herders, seafarers, miners. They carved their lives into rock in memory. Greek traders who sailed north from cities like Corinth and Corcyra described them as stubborn and proud. To the Illyrians, the Greeks were useful but foreign. By the 7th century BCE, Greek colonies had begun to appear along the Illyrian coast. Among them was Apollonia, founded near what is today Fear. It became a thriving port, a meeting place between Illyrian tribes and the wider Mediterranean world. Amphorae filled with wine arrived from the south. Silver and timber moved outward. Cultures met, but they did not merge. Not yet, and in the mountains, beyond the reach of coastal trade, the Illyrian tribes maintained their independence. Each clan was bound by blood and loyalty. Honor was currency. Revenge was law. Power belonged to those who could hold it. Among these tribes emerged leaders who would step from legend into recorded history. One of the most formidable was Queen Tuta in the 3rd century BCE. She ruled over a confederation of Illyrian tribes and commanded a fleet that dominated the Adriatic Sea. To Rome, still rising, still hungry, Tuta was not merely a queen. She was a problem. Illyrian piracy, as the Romans called it, disrupted trade routes. Roman merchants were seized. Roman pride was wounded. And Rome, even in its early expansion, did not tolerate insult. The First Illyrian War began in 229 BCE. Roman legions crossed the Adriatic. Warships cut through the waters Illyrian sailors once ruled. Tuta fought, but Rome did not merely defeat enemies, it absorbed them. By 168 BCE, Illyrian resistance was broken. The last Illyrian king, Gentius, was captured. The region fell under Roman control. Here, the first great turning point in the land's destiny unfolded. Under Rome, the Illyrian territories were reorganized into provinces. Roads were built, most famously the Via Egnatia, linking the Adriatic coast to Byzantium. Cities flourished under Roman architecture and administration. Latin inscriptions appeared. Amphitheaters rose. Christianity began its quiet spread in the early centuries CE, yet even under Rome, something endured. Languages shift under empire. Cultures bend. But in the mountains, beyond the polished marble of Roman towns, older customs survived. The people adapted, but they did not vanish. When the Roman Empire split in 395 CE into western and eastern halves, the lands of modern Albania fell under the Eastern Roman, later called the Byzantine Empire. Rome's western half collapsed in 476 CE. But in the east, Constantinople endured. For centuries, these lands were a frontier. Goths passed through like storms. Huns thundered across plains. Later came Slavic migrations in the 6th and 7th centuries, altering the demographic landscape of the Balkans. Villages shifted. Languages mingled. New identities formed. And yet, through all of it, the ancestors of the Albanians persisted. Scholars debate the precise continuity between the Illyrians and modern Albanians, but linguistic evidence suggests deep roots. The Albanian language stands apart in the Indo-European family, a branch of its own. It absorbed Latin vocabulary during Roman rule. Greek influences from the south, Slavic words from migrations, but its core remained distinct. Like the mountains, by the medieval period, the name Albania began to appear in Byzantine records. The term Arbanon was used in the 11th century to describe a principality in the region. The people were called Arbor or Arbora. Identity was taking shape, not yet national in the modern sense, but cultural, linguistic, regional. The Middle Ages in the Balkans were not peaceful. Power shifted constantly between Byzantines, Bulgarians, Serbs, Normans, and local rulers. Fortresses changed hands. Alliances were temporary. Betrayal was common currency. In the 12th century, the Principality of Arbanon emerged as one of the first medieval Albanian states. It was small, but significant. It represented something vital, political organization tied to a local identity. But Albania's geography, while protective, was also isolating. Mountain strongholds meant survival, but they also meant fragmentation. Clan loyalties often outweighed broader unity. As the 13th and 14th centuries unfolded, Serbian expansion under Stefan Dusan reshaped much of the Balkans. For a time, much of Albania fell under Serbian rule. Yet once more, centralized control proved fragile. After Dusan's death, his empire fractured, and in that fragmentation, local Albanian noble families rose to prominence, families whose names would echo in chronicles and legend. The Castrioti, the Balsha, the Dhopia. Among them would rise a figure who would define not only this first chapter of Albanian history, but its very soul. But before he appears, we must understand the storm gathering on the horizon. To the east, a new power was emerging, the Ottoman Turks. In the 14th century, the Ottomans crossed into Europe. What had begun as a small Anatolian beylik transformed into an expanding empire. They defeated Serbian forces at the Battle of Kosovo in 1389. The Balkans trembled. Albanian territories, fragmented and divided among noble families, faced a choice that was no choice at all: submission or resistance. Some nobles accepted Ottoman suzerainty. Others resisted. Many attempted to balance survival with autonomy. Sons of noble families were taken as hostages to the Ottoman court, converted, educated, and trained within the Ottoman system. One of those sons was named George Castrioti. Taken as a boy, raised in the Ottoman court, trained as a soldier, he would one day return. And when he did, he would not return as a servant of empire, he would return as something else. But that is for later. For now, we pause at the edge of transformation. In this first great arc of Albanian history, we have witnessed the land before the name, the tribes before the nation, the endurance of identity through conquest, Illyrian resistance, Roman administration, Byzantine frontier life, Slavic migrations, medieval fragmentation. The conflict that defines this opening act is not a single war, but survival itself. The land versus empire, the mountain versus the road, the tribe versus the throne, and at the heart of it, a quiet but persistent theme: continuity. Albania is not born in a single moment. It forms like stone shaped by centuries of wind. Every invasion leaves a mark, but does not erase the foundation. The Adriatic still crashes against its shores. The mountains still rise like walls. And in their shadow, a people prepare, knowingly or not, for the defining struggle that will carve their name into European memory. The eagle has not yet taken flight, but it is watching. The boy who would become a legend did not grow up in his own land. He grew up beneath domes of polished stone, inside the disciplined machinery of an empire that did not forgive weakness. He learned Turkish before he could fully remember the lullabies of his mother tongue. He trained with other sons of conquered nobles. He rode horses across Anatolian plains instead of the valleys of his homeland. His name was George Castriot. The Ottomans called him Iskender, Alexander, after the conqueror whose shadow still loomed over soldiers' dreams. To them, he was a promising commander. To his father's people, he was a hostage. To history, he would become something else entirely. In the early 15th century, the Ottoman Empire was expanding with ruthless efficiency. After the victory at Kosovo in 1389 and the gradual subjugation of Balkan territories, Ottoman banners advanced steadily westward. Albanian principalities, fractured and often rivalrous, were drawn into the imperial orbit. Some nobles bent, some resisted. Many tried to survive. George's father, John Castrioti, was one such noble. Pressured by Ottoman expansion, he submitted and sent his sons to the Ottoman court as guarantees of loyalty. It was a common practice, cruel but strategic. The empire did not just conquer lands, it absorbed talent. Inside the Ottoman military structure, George rose quickly. He became a capable cavalry commander, earning the trust of his superiors. He fought in campaigns that pushed the empire deeper into Europe. He learned discipline. He learned patience. He learned the structure of the empire from within, but something endured beneath the uniform. In 1443, during the Battle of Niš against Hungarian forces led by John Hunyadi, the Ottoman army suffered defeat. In the chaos of retreat, George made a decision that would change not only his life but the destiny of his homeland. He defected. With a small group of loyal Albanian soldiers, he rode west. Using a forged decree bearing the Ottoman seal, he secured control of the fortress of Kruj, his family's ancestral stronghold. Once inside, he raised a different banner, the black double-headed eagle on a red field. In that moment, the story of Albania entered its most dramatic act. George Castriot would no longer be known as Iskender. He would be remembered as Skanderbeg. The conflict was no longer subtle survival within empire. It was open resistance, but Skanderbeg understood something that earlier Albanian nobles had not: division meant defeat. Clan rivalries had weakened resistance before. If Albania were to withstand the Ottoman war machine, unity was essential. In 1444, at the town of Lajja, Albanian nobles gathered. The meeting became known as the League of Lajja. It was not a modern nation-state assembly. It was a military alliance, fragile, pragmatic, and necessary. Families who had once competed for territory now pledged cooperation against a common enemy. The empire responded swiftly. Sultan Murad II could not allow rebellion in the Western Balkans. Armies marched toward Cluj. Siege engines rolled across valleys. The Ottomans expected a swift suppression. They were wrong. Skanderbeg's strategy was not brute confrontation. He used terrain as a weapon. Narrow mountain passes became ambush points. Small, mobile units harassed larger Ottoman forces. Supply lines were targeted. Retreats were calculated. The first siege of Cluj in 1450 tested everything. Ottoman forces encircled the fortress, expecting starvation and surrender. Inside the walls, resources dwindled. Outside, Skanderbeg launched constant raids. Months passed, the fortress did not fall. When the Ottomans finally withdrew, it was not just a military victory, it was psychological defiance. A small mountain resistance had repelled one of the most formidable empires of its age. Across Europe, word spread. In Rome and Venice, Skanderbeg was praised as a defender of Christendom. The papacy sent support. The Kingdom of Naples offered alliances. Albania, once a fragmented frontier, had become a symbol. But symbols carry weight. Resistance meant relentless war. The Ottomans returned again and again. Campaign followed campaign. Cluj faced multiple sieges. Each time, the cost grew heavier. Inside villages, farmers became soldiers. Churches became fortifications. Families lived between hope and fear. War was no longer episodic, it was constant. Skanderbeg was not merely a warrior. He was a diplomat navigating impossible terrain. He balanced alliances with Venice, negotiated with Naples, maintained papal favor, all while preserving autonomy. External support was valuable, but Albania could not become a pawn. This tension, between survival through alliance and the risk of dependency, formed a subtle but powerful undercurrent in his leadership. In private moments, what did Skanderbeg feel? Chroniclers describe him as charismatic, disciplined, devout. But he was also a man shaped by dual identity, raised within the Ottoman system, fighting against it. He knew his enemy's strengths intimately. He knew their command structures, their expectations. He knew how to surprise them. The battles were not always victories. There were losses. Towns fell. Resources drained. And yet, for 25 years, Albania resisted. 25 years, in an era when entire kingdoms collapsed within seasons. This endurance was extraordinary. The climactic tension of this era built not in a single decisive battle, but in accumulation. Each siege was heavier than the last. Each campaign tested loyalty within the league. Could unity survive exhaustion? Could clans remain aligned under constant strain? By the 1460s, the Ottoman Empire had grown even stronger under Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 sent shockwaves across Europe. If the great Byzantine capital could fall, what hope did a mountain principality have? Yet Cluj still stood. In 1468, Skanderbeg fell ill. War had consumed decades of his life. His health declined in the town of Lajja, the same town where unity had been forged. When he died in January 1468, the resistance did not die instantly, but its heart was gone, leadership fragmented. Ottoman pressure intensified. One by one, fortresses fell. Cluj held out a few more years before finally succumbing in 1478. Shkodër followed in 1479 after fierce resistance. The long defiance ended not with triumphant independence, but with exhaustion. Albania was absorbed into the Ottoman Empire. But defeat in territory is not defeat in memory. Skanderbeg became legend. Stories of his courage circulated in ballads and chronicles. In Rome, he was celebrated. In Albanian villages, his name became synonymous with resistance. Mothers told their children of the eagle who defied empire. The double-headed eagle endured as symbol, two heads looking east and west, perhaps reflecting the land's position between worlds. And here lies the deeper arc of this chapter. The central conflict was empire versus resistance, but beneath it ran a more intimate tension, unity versus fragmentation. Skanderbeg's greatest achievement was not a single battlefield triumph, it was forging cooperation among fiercely independent clans. When he died, that unity faltered. The Ottoman period that followed would last more than 4 centuries, but it would not erase identity. Instead, it would reshape it. Under Ottoman rule, Albania transformed. Islam spread gradually, particularly in urban centers and among elites seeking opportunity within imperial administration. Many Albanians rose to high positions within the Ottoman state: grand viziers, generals, governors. The relationship was complex, subjugation intertwined with participation. Church bells still rang in some valleys. Mosques rose in towns. Bektashi Sufi lodges took root, blending spiritual traditions. Religious diversity became part of the Albanian experience. The mountains remained stubborn. Customary law, the canon, continued to regulate life in highland regions. Honor codes governed blood feuds. family loyalty outweighed distant imperial authority. Ottoman control was strongest in cities, looser in remote terrain. The eagle had been forced to lower its wings, but it had not been caged. As this second act closes, Albania stands at a paradox: politically conquered, culturally resilient, religiously diverse, socially divided yet symbolically united by memory. Skanderbeg's death did not end the story, it transformed it. Resistance shifted from open warfare to preservation of language, custom, and identity within empire. The empire would endure centuries. But so would the memory of defiance, and memory, in the Balkans, is never passive, it waits. When the banners of resistance fell and the last great fortresses surrendered, the land did not erupt into flames, it exhaled. After decades of war under Skanderbeg, Albania did not collapse into oblivion. It entered something quieter, something heavier. A long era where survival meant adaptation instead of open rebellion. The Ottoman Empire did not erase Albania. It absorbed it, and absorption is more complex than destruction. By the late 15th century, Ottoman administration was firmly established. Sanjaks, administrative districts, were organized. Tax systems formalized. Military levies structured. Roads linked towns more tightly to imperial networks stretching from the Balkans to Anatolia and beyond. But empire was not uniform across mountains and valleys. In coastal towns and fertile lowlands, Ottoman authority was visible and structured. Mosques rose beside churches. Markets bustled under new regulations. Judges appointed by the empire adjudicated disputes, yet in the highlands, particularly in the north, the empire's grip loosened. Geography became autonomy's shield. Here, life continued under the canon. The canon was not a single book in its earliest form. It was an oral code, passed through generations. It governed marriage, property, hospitality, honor, and blood feuds. It was strict, uncompromising, and deeply embedded in social structure. Under Ottoman rule, two systems coexisted uneasily: imperial law and customary law. This duality became one of the defining features of Albanian identity. Religious transformation unfolded slowly, unevenly. Initially, the majority of Albanians remained Christian, both Catholic in the north and Orthodox in the south. But over the centuries, Islam spread. Some converted for pragmatic reasons: lower taxes, access to positions within administration, military careers. Others were drawn by spiritual movements such as the Bektashi order, a Sufi brotherhood whose mystical practices resonated deeply in Albanian society. By the 17th century, a significant portion of the population had embraced Islam. Albania became religiously diverse: Muslims, Catholics, Orthodox Christians living often in close proximity. And yet, religion did not fracture ethnic identity as it did elsewhere in the Balkans. Language endured as a stronger thread than faith. This was the quiet conflict of the Ottoman centuries, not open war, but internal negotiation. How to remain oneself while living inside empire. How to balance faith and language, clan and state, survival and dignity. Some Albanians rose high within Ottoman ranks. Grand viziers of Albanian origin served sultans. Generals commanded imperial armies. Administrators governed provinces far from their ancestral mountains. The empire did not merely rule Albanians, it employed them. But power within empire is not independence. Meanwhile, beyond Albania's borders, Europe was shifting. Renaissance ideas bloomed in Italy. The Reformation fractured Christianity. The Ottoman Empire clashed repeatedly with Habsburg Austria and Venice. The Balkans were no longer just frontier, they were a contested corridor. Albania stood between worlds. In the 17th century, uprisings occasionally flared. Often local, rarely coordinated, they were suppressed. Fragmentation remained the great obstacle. Clan loyalty still outweighed collective national identity. And here lies the subtle tension of this period. Identity existed, but nationhood did not yet crystallize. In village gatherings, elders recited genealogies tracing back centuries. Songs preserved the memory of Skanderbeg. The double-headed eagle lingered in oral tradition. But there was no unified political vision tying north to south, mountain to coast. The Ottoman system was pragmatic. As long as taxes were paid and order maintained, autonomy in remote regions was tolerated. Highland tribes negotiated arrangements granting them limited self-governance in exchange for loyalty or military service. This fragile balance allowed culture to persist, but it also delayed cohesion. By the 18th century, the Ottoman Empire began showing signs of strain. Central authority weakened. Provincial governors gained increasing autonomy. In Albania, powerful local rulers emerged, figures who operated almost as independent princes while still nominally under Ottoman sovereignty. One of the most formidable was Ali Pasha of Tepelina. He was not a nationalist in the modern sense. He was ambitious, strategic, and ruthless. By the late 18th century, he controlled large territories in southern Albania and parts of Greece from his stronghold in Ioannina. Ali Pasha modernized infrastructure, fostered trade, and navigated alliances between the Ottomans, France, and Britain. European travelers wrote about his court with fascination and suspicion. He embodied the paradox of Albanian experience under empire, rising through imperial structures while cultivating regional autonomy. But ambition carries risk. The Ottoman Sultan eventually viewed Ali Pasha as too independent. In 1820, imperial forces moved against him. After prolonged resistance, he was killed in 1822. His fall revealed a truth: local power without unified national backing could not withstand central imperial force indefinitely. And yet, seeds were stirring. The 19th century brought a new force to the Balkans: nationalism. Across Europe, ideas of nationhood began redefining identity. Language, culture, shared history, these became the foundations of political claims. The Greeks rose in revolution against Ottoman rule in 1821. Serbia had already begun carving autonomy earlier in the century. Albania watched. But Albania was divided not only by clan, but by religion and geography. How could a national movement emerge across Muslim, Catholic, and Orthodox communities? The answer would not come immediately. Throughout the early 19th century, Albanian intellectuals began focusing on language. Unlike neighboring peoples who had liturgical traditions in Greek or Church Slavonic, the Albanian language lacked standardized written form widely used in education. Language became both vulnerability and potential. In villages, it thrived orally. In administration and religion, other languages dominated: Ottoman Turkish, Greek, Slavic languages. If identity were to solidify into nationhood, language would need to become visible. This realization marked the beginning of what would later be called the Albanian national awakening, the Rilinja. But in this episode, we remain before its full ignition. The Ottoman centuries were not empty. They were formative. They shaped Albania's religious mosaic. They preserved clan codes. They fostered resilience through adaptation. They created a society accustomed to navigating layered authority. The climax of this era is subtle, not a battlefield, but a realization that survival inside empire could not last forever. By the mid-19th century, the Ottoman Empire was labeled the sick man of Europe. External pressures mounted. Russia, Austria-Hungary, and other powers eyed Balkan territories. If the empire weakened further, who would claim Albanian lands? This looming question created anxiety. Albanians did not want partition between neighboring states. Yet without unified political structure, they risked precisely that fate. The long silence was ending. In coffeehouses and merchant homes, in monasteries and mosques, discussions began to shift. Not rebellion yet, but consciousness. Who are we? What binds us beyond clan and creed? Can language unite where religion divides? The eagle had survived centuries under shadow. Now, in the dim light of a changing Europe, it began to stir again, not with swords drawn, but with words forming. Faith had reshaped the land. Blood codes had governed it. Empire had enveloped it. But beneath all of it, something patient endured. Identity, and identity, once awakened, does not easily return to silence. In the cafes of Istanbul, in the port cities of Italy, in the mountain towns of Shkodër and Gjirokastër, a new kind of conversation began to unfold in the 19th century. It was not about clan honor. It was not about blood feuds. It was not about survival within empire. It was about identity. For centuries, Albanians had lived under the Ottoman system, adapting, negotiating, enduring. But now the empire trembled. Nationalist movements were reshaping the Balkans. Greece had gained independence. Serbia was consolidating autonomy. Bulgaria stirred with revolutionary zeal. The great powers of Europe, Russia, Austria-Hungary, Britain, were circling like cautious predators, waiting for the Ottoman structure to fracture. And if it fractured, what would happen to the Albanian lands? Partition, that was the fear. Unlike neighboring peoples, Albanians were divided by religion. Muslims, Catholics, Orthodox Christians. Different alphabets used in different regions. Different spheres of influence pulling them in different directions. Religion could have torn them apart. Instead, language would bind them. This was the heart of the Albanian national awakening, the Rilinja. It did not begin with armies. It began with ink. Writers, teachers, and intellectuals began promoting the Albanian language as the core of national identity. Newspapers appeared. Textbooks were printed secretly. Societies formed in diaspora communities, from Bucharest to Istanbul. In living rooms lit by oil lamps, debates raged quietly. Are we Muslims first? One voice might ask, are we Orthodox? Another would counter, no. Someone would insist softly, we are Albanian. This shift was revolutionary. For centuries, identity in the Balkans had been tied primarily to religion. Now, for Albanians, language became the defining thread. A shared tongue stronger than doctrinal differences. The central conflict of this era was internal before it was external. Could Albanians see themselves as one people despite religious diversity? Could clans accustomed to autonomy imagine a unified political future? Events accelerated in 1878. That year, the Russo-Turkish War ended with the Treaty of San Stefano, granting large territorial gains to Slavic states in the Balkans. Albanian inhabited lands were at risk of being distributed to Montenegro Montenegro, Serbia, and Bulgaria, alarm spread. If Albanians did not organize, they would be divided without a voice. In June 1878, leaders gathered in the city of Prizren. Muslims and Christians sat side by side. Landowners, clerics, intellectuals, men who might once have distrusted one another, now shared a common fear. This gathering became known as the League of Prizren. It was a defining moment. The League did not initially demand full independence from the Ottoman Empire. Instead, it sought autonomy within the empire and, most urgently, the protection of Albanian territories from foreign partition. Petitions were sent. Delegations formed. Armed resistance organized in some areas to prevent neighboring states from claiming Albanian lands. The League represented a transformation, Albanians acting collectively in defense of a shared national space. But unity remained fragile. Some leaders favored continued loyalty to the Ottoman Sultan in exchange for autonomy. Others envisioned eventual independence. External powers viewed the movement with suspicion. The Ottoman authorities, initially tolerant of the League as a counterweight to Slavic expansion, soon grew wary of its assertiveness. When the League resisted Ottoman decisions directly, imperial forces moved to suppress it. By 1881, the League of Prizren was crushed militarily, but ideas cannot be crushed as easily as armies. The suppression did not extinguish the awakening, it intensified it. Throughout the late 19th century, the Albanian question persisted in European diplomacy. Meanwhile, cultural efforts expanded. Schools teaching in Albanian were established despite opposition. Writers like Naim Frashëri composed poetry celebrating Albanian heritage, blending romantic nationalism with spiritual themes. Printing the Albanian language itself was an act of defiance. There was another problem, the alphabet. Albanians wrote in multiple scripts, Arabic-based for Muslim communities, Greek-based for Orthodox communities, Latin-based in Catholic regions. Without a standardized alphabet, education and unity were hindered. In 1908, delegates gathered in the city of Manastir, modern Bitolia, to resolve this issue. The Congress of Manastir standardized the Albanian alphabet, adopting a Latin-based script. It was more than orthography, it was a declaration. A shared script meant shared literature, shared education, shared consciousness. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire was entering its final convulsions. The Young Turk Revolution of 1908 promised reforms in constitutional governance. Albanians initially welcomed the changes, hoping for greater autonomy, but centralization efforts by the new Ottoman leadership clashed with Albanian demands. Uprisings broke out between 1910 and 1912. This time, resistance was not isolated clan rebellion, it carried national intent. The atmosphere thickened with inevitability. As the First Balkan War erupted in 1912, Serbia, Montenegro, Greece, and Bulgaria attacked the Ottoman Empire to seize remaining European territories. Ottoman defenses collapsed rapidly. For Albanians, this was both opportunity and danger. If they waited, their lands would be divided by victorious neighbors. If they acted, they might secure independence. On November 28, 1912, in the coastal city of Vlora, representatives gathered. A flag was raised, the black double-headed eagle on red, echoing the banner of Skanderbeg centuries earlier. Albania declared independence. The declaration was bold, but precarious. There was no fully formed army, no stable government structure. Foreign powers held enormous influence over Balkan outcomes. The borders of the new state were uncertain and contested. In 1913, the Conference of London recognized Albania as an independent principality, but its borders excluded large Albanian populations in Kosovo and other regions, leaving deep wounds that would echo through the 20th century. Independence had been achieved, but sovereignty remained fragile. A European prince, Wilhelm of Wied, was installed as ruler in 1914 in an attempt to stabilize the fledgling state. He arrived to a land fractured by internal divisions and external interference. Within months, World War I erupted. Prince Wilhelm departed. Albania descended into chaos as foreign armies occupied different regions, Austro-Hungarian, Italian, Greek, Serbian forces carving influence zones. The young nation seemed to dissolve before it had solidified, and here lies the dramatic crest of this episode. After centuries of survival under empire, after the intellectual awakening, after unity forged in language and symbol, independence arrived at the worst possible moment. It was as if the eagle had taken flight only to find the sky filled with storms. The internal conflict of identity had matured into political action. The external conflict of great power rivalry now threatened to undo it. Yet something fundamental had changed. Albanians now possessed a shared national narrative, they had a standardized language, they had a flag recognized internationally, they had declared themselves. Even as war engulfed Europe, the idea of Albania could no longer be erased. this episode closes not in triumph, but in tension. The birth of the Albanian state coincided with global catastrophe. Its borders were drawn by foreign diplomats. Its sovereignty tested immediately, but for the first time in recorded history, Albania existed not merely as a region, not merely as a memory of resistance, but as a nation. The awakening was complete. Now it would face the brutal test of survival in the modern world. When Albania declared independence in 1912, it did not step into calm waters, it stepped into a hurricane. The ink on the declaration in Vlora had barely dried when the Balkan Wars redrew the map around it. By the time the great powers formally recognized Albania in 1913 at the Conference of London, the country existed more as a diplomatic compromise than a stable state. Its borders were narrow and contested. Large Albanian populations remained outside the new frontiers, especially in Kosovo. The wound was immediate and deep. Independence had been achieved, but unity was incomplete. The European powers, wary of Balkan instability, decided Albania needed a neutral monarch, someone detached from internal rivalries. In 1914, they installed Prince Wilhelm of Wied, a German nobleman unfamiliar with the land he was to govern. He arrived to a country without functioning institutions, without a unified army, without economic infrastructure. He faced rival clans, religious divisions, and foreign agents maneuvering for influence. The prince tried to project authority, but authority requires roots. And Albania's roots were still tangled. Then, like thunder breaking overhead, World War I erupted. Within months, Prince Wilhelm departed. Albania became a battlefield and bargaining chip. Austro-Hungarian forces occupied parts of the north. Italian troops landed in the south. Greek forces moved in from the southeast. Serbian troops entered from the northeast. The young nation fragmented before it could solidify. Villages saw uniforms change multiple times within a year. Farmers grew accustomed to new flags rising and falling. Supplies were requisitioned. Roads were commandeered. The idea of Albania persisted, but the state dissolved into occupation zones. This was the first great modern crisis of the Albanian nation. Could an identity survive when sovereignty collapses? The war ended in 1918, but peace brought uncertainty. At the Paris Peace Conference, Albania's future was again debated. Some powers considered partitioning its territory among neighbors. The country lacked strong diplomatic representation. Yet something had shifted since the 19th century. Albanians no longer saw themselves as a loose cultural group. They saw themselves as a nation whose existence had been declared. In January 1920, representatives gathered in the town of Ljusheng. The Congress of Ljusheng reasserted national sovereignty, rejected foreign mandates, and established a new government. Tirana was chosen as the capital, a strategic compromise between North and South. This moment was critical. Unlike the externally imposed monarchy of 1914, this reorganization emerged from within. Soon after, Albanian forces confronted Italian troops attempting to maintain control over the port of Vlora. In what became known as the Vlora War of 1920, Albanian resistance forced Italy to withdraw from most of its occupied territories. It was a symbolic victory. For the first time since independence, Albania defended itself successfully as a cohesive entity. But internal tensions remained. Politics in the 1920s became volatile. Power shifted rapidly between factions representing regional, ideological, and personal loyalties. Some advocated liberal democratic reforms. Others favored centralized authority. Among the rising figures of this turbulent era was Ahmet Zogu. Born into a powerful northern clan, Zogu was pragmatic, ambitious, and acutely aware of Albania's fragility. He navigated alliances with skill, positioning himself as a stabilizing force amid chaos. Opposing him was a reformist movement led by figures like Fan Nali, an intellectual, cleric, and political leader advocating democratic modernization and social reform. In 1924, political tensions exploded. After the assassination of a reformist leader, unrest spread. Zogu fled temporarily as Nali assumed leadership in what became known as the June Revolution. Nali's government promised sweeping reforms, land redistribution, reduction of feudal influence, modernization of state institutions, but vision without power is vulnerable. Within months, Zogu returned with external backing and reasserted control. Nali went into exile. Zogu consolidated authority. This marked the beginning of a new chapter, stability through strongman rule. In 1928, Ahmet Zogu declared himself King Zogai of Albania. It was a bold move. From tribal chieftain's son to monarch of a modern European state, Zog sought to project legitimacy and continuity. He adopted Western-style reforms, strengthened the central administration, and attempted to suppress blood feuds and clan-based rivalries. He understood that Albania's greatest vulnerability was fragmentation. Under Zog's rule, roads were constructed, civil codes modernized, education expanded modestly. Efforts were made to curtail the canon's dominance in legal matters, integrating customary law into state structures rather than allowing it to operate independently. but modernization required funding. Albania's economy was weak, largely agrarian, lacking industry. Zog turned increasingly to Italy for financial and military support. This created a dangerous dependency. Italy, under Benito Mussolini, harbored imperial ambitions in the Adriatic. Mussolini viewed Albania as strategically vital, a gateway to Balkan influence. Loans and advisors flowed into Albania. Italian officers trained the army. Infrastructure projects tied the economy closer to Rome. On the surface, Zog maintained sovereignty. Beneath it, Italian leverage grew. The tension was subtle but ominous. Was Albania modernizing or drifting toward client-state status? Zog attempted to balance this relationship carefully. At times he resisted Italian pressure, seeking to diversify alliances. But economic reality limited his options. Meanwhile, Europe darkened, fascism rose in Italy. Nazism consolidated power in Germany. Democratic institutions weakened across the continent. Small nations faced existential uncertainty. On April 7, 1939, the tension snapped. Italian forces invaded Albania. The assault was swift. King Zog fled into exile with his family and treasury. Italian troops occupied Tirana. Albania was formally annexed into the Italian Empire. For the second time in a generation, Albania's sovereignty evaporated, but this invasion differed from Ottoman absorption centuries earlier. This was modern occupation, propaganda, military control, political restructuring. Albania was declared a protectorate of Italy. The Albanian crown was offered to King Victor Emmanuel III of Italy. Italian settlers arrived. Infrastructure projects accelerated, but under foreign authority. World War II engulfed Europe shortly after. When Italy capitulated in 1943, German forces moved quickly to occupy Albania. Determined to prevent Allied advances through the Balkans, occupation deepened hardship. Resources were extracted. Political factions formed within Albania, some collaborating, others resisting. It was during this period that a new force began to organize. Communist partisans led by a young figure named Enver Hoxha. But before that new chapter begins, we must linger in the tension of 1939. The arc of this episode is stark. Albania achieved independence. It survived post-war fragmentation. It built a monarchy. It sought modernization. It balanced foreign pressure. And yet, its sovereignty collapsed once more under the weight of larger powers. The recurring theme emerges clearly. Albania's struggle has never been only internal. It has always unfolded at the crossroads of empires. The climax of this chapter is not just the Italian invasion, it is the realization that fragile institutions, economic dependency, and geopolitical vulnerability can undo decades of effort in a single week. But beneath occupation, something else was forming, a resistance not led by monarchs, not tied to clans, not rooted in aristocracy, a resistance built on ideology. As Europe burned in total war, Albania stood again at a turning point. The fragile crown had fallen, a new order was waiting in the shadows. When Italian ships appeared on the horizon in April 1939, Albania had barely begun to steady itself as a kingdom. When those ships were replaced by German columns in 1943, the illusion of sovereignty dissolved completely. But occupation does something dangerous. It forces people to choose collaboration or resistance, survival or sacrifice, silence or defiance. By the time Nazi Germany replaced Italy as occupying power in 1943, Albania was no longer simply a conquered state, it was a battlefield of ideologies. Monarchists loyal to the exiled King Zog maneuvered cautiously. Nationalist groups sought a non-communist independent Albania. And in the mountains, a tightly organized movement began to gather force. At its center stood a schoolteacher turned revolutionary, Enver Hoxha. Hoxha was not born into nobility. He did not inherit clan authority. He did not claim ancient lineage. His power would come from organization, ideology, and relentless discipline. In 1941, the Albanian Communist Party was formed, aligning itself with broader anti-fascist movements in Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union. Initially small and fragmented, the movement grew rapidly as occupation intensified resentment. Partisan units began operating in mountainous terrain, ambushing enemy patrols, sabotaging infrastructure, distributing propaganda. Villagers hid fighters. Women carried messages across dangerous terrain. Youth joined armed brigades. World War II turned Albania into a crucible. The conflict was no longer solely foreign occupation. It became a civil struggle. Nationalist groups such as the Balkan clashed with communist partisans not only over tactics but over the future of Albania itself. Would the country emerge as a democratic republic, a restored monarchy, or a socialist state aligned with Moscow? By late 1944, as German forces retreated from the Balkans, communist partisans had secured decisive control over much of Albania. Unlike many Eastern European countries, where Soviet troops imposed communist governments, Albania's communists largely seized power through domestic military success. In November 1944, Tirana was liberated. Soon after, Enver Hoxha consolidated authority. The monarchy was formally abolished in 1946. Albania was declared the People's Republic of Albania. A new era began. At first, the transformation seemed to promise modernization. Feudal structures were dismantled. Large estates were confiscated. Industry was nationalized. Literacy campaigns spread into rural areas. Women gained formal legal equality. Roads and factories were built. The state moved aggressively to eliminate clan structures and blood feuds rooted in the canon. Religion, viewed as backward and divisive, came under pressure. But revolutionary zeal carries its own shadow. Political opponents were arrested. Trials were swift. Executions followed. Prisons filled with suspected dissenters. Surveillance expanded. The central conflict of this episode is not external invasion, but internal control. How does a nation that fought for sovereignty become one of the most isolated regimes in the world? Initially, Albania aligned closely with Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union. Soviet aid flowed in. Industrialization projects began. Albanian students studied in Moscow. The country entered the Warsaw Pact, but Hoxha's loyalty was not flexible. When Stalin died in 1953 and Nikita Khrushchev later denounced Stalin's crimes, the ideological earthquake reached Tirana. Hoxha rejected de-Stalinization. He saw reform as betrayal. In 1961, Albania severed relations with the Soviet Union. Isolation deepened. Hoxha then aligned Albania with Maoist China, praising Mao Zedong as the true guardian of revolutionary purity. Chinese aid replaced Soviet support. Factories were constructed with Chinese assistance. Political rhetoric intensified, but global politics shifted again. When China began rapprochement with the United States in the 1970s, Hoxha condemned it. By 1978, Albania broke ties with China as well. Now, Albania stood alone, completely alone. The Iron Curtain was not merely a metaphor here, it was reinforced by concrete and fear. Hundreds of thousands of bunkers were constructed across the country, small domed structures embedded in hillsides, fields, beaches. They were built in preparation for invasions that never came. Children grew up playing near them. Farmers plowed around them. They became symbols of paranoia. Inside homes, conversations were cautious. The Sigurimi, the state security apparatus, monitored dissent ruthlessly. Informants existed in neighborhoods, workplaces, even families. Religion was banned outright in 1967. Albania declared itself the world's first atheist state. Churches and mosques were closed or converted into warehouses. Religious leaders were imprisoned. Generations grew up without formal religious practice. And yet, even under rigid control, something human persisted. Literacy rates soared. Healthcare improved. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. Industrial centers like Elbasan developed. Rural electrification expanded. The state promoted a narrative of self-reliance and revolutionary pride, but economic inefficiency grew alongside ideological rigidity. Isolation limited trade and technological advancement. Consumer goods were scarce. Travel abroad was nearly impossible. Borders were heavily fortified. Attempting to flee could mean death. The psychological impact was profound. Albania became a sealed society. Citizens were told they were surrounded by enemies, NATO to the west, Yugoslavia to the north, Greece to the south, revisionists everywhere. Fear became governance, and yet, beneath the fear, identity endured in a new form. The state rewrote history to emphasize national resilience. Skanderbeg reimagined as proto-revolutionary hero, resistance woven into communist narrative. The regime positioned itself as defender of sovereignty against imperialism. It was a powerful message in a land long shaped by foreign domination. But sovereignty without freedom creates its own tension. By the 1980s, economic stagnation was undeniable. Infrastructure aged. Shortages deepened. The outside world modernized rapidly. Television images and whispered stories of life beyond the border contrasted sharply with Albania's austere reality. Enver Hoxha ruled until his death in 1985. For over 4 decades, he had defined Albania's trajectory, transforming it from a fragile monarchy into one of the most isolated communist states on earth. When he died, the question hung heavy. What happens when a system built on one man's ideology loses its architect? His successor, Ramazalia, attempted cautious reforms, but change was slow. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989. Eastern Europe's communist regimes collapsed in rapid succession. Albania could not remain untouched forever. Protests began in 1990. Students demanded political pluralism. Citizens demanded travel rights, free elections, economic opportunity. The Iron Curtain cracked. The climax of this episode is not a single battle or speech, it is the slow erosion of fear. For decades, isolation had defined Albania's identity. Now the walls were trembling. The arc of this chapter is stark and dramatic: liberation from fascism, rise of revolutionary state, consolidation of power, ideological purity turned into isolation, isolation hardened into stagnation, Albania had preserved sovereignty, but at immense cost. As the 20th century approached its final decade, the nation stood again at a threshold. This time, the enemy was not empire, not fascism, not monarchy, it was the weight of its own system. The bunkers still dotted the landscape, the mountains still stood. The eagle remained on the flag, but the cage built in the name of protection was beginning to fracture. And once people glimpsed the possibility of open skies, they rarely accept confinement again. In the winter of 1990, something shifted in the air over Tirana. For decades, Albania had existed in near total isolation under Enver Hoxha and later his successor, Ramazalia. Bunkers scarred the hillsides. Borders were sealed. The outside world was portrayed as a hostile threat waiting to destroy the nation's purity. But the outside world had changed. The Berlin Wall had fallen in 1989. Communist regimes across Eastern Europe collapsed in rapid succession. Romania's dictator was executed. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, all were transforming before the eyes of history. Albania, long the most isolated of them all, trembled. It did not begin with gunfire. It began with whispers. Students at the University of Tirana began gathering in small groups. They spoke cautiously at first about shortages, about unemployment, about the impossibility of travel, about the widening gap between propaganda and reality. Electricity flickered in dormitories. Heating failed in winter. Shelves in stores were often empty. The state that had promised self-reliance could no longer mask stagnation, and then the whispers turned into chants. In December 1990, student protests erupted in Tirana demanding political pluralism. They called for reforms, for free elections, for the right to form opposition parties. The demonstrations grew. Workers joined. Intellectuals added their voices. The regime hesitated. Unlike earlier decades, when dissent was crushed without hesitation, the leadership sensed that repression could ignite uncontrollable unrest. Ramazalia attempted dialogue. Limited reforms were promised, but history was accelerating. By early 1991, Albania held its first multi-party elections in decades. The old Communist Party, rebranded and still entrenched in state structures, initially maintained control. But the momentum of change was irreversible. Statues of Enver Hoxha were toppled by crowds in Tirana. The symbolic fall of bronze and stone echoed far louder than the sound of metal hitting pavement. For generations, Hoxha's image had loomed over the nation. Now it lay shattered in public squares. The psychological barrier had broken. The central conflict of this episode is transformation versus collapse. How does a nation move from rigid authoritarianism to democracy without tearing itself apart? The early 1990s were turbulent. Economic structures built on state planning unraveled quickly. Factories closed. Unemployment surged. Inflation soared. The old system had suppressed private enterprise. The new system lacked experience in managing a market economy. Opportunity and chaos arrived together. In 1992, the Democratic Party won parliamentary elections. A new era officially began. Among the prominent political figures emerging during this transition was Sali Berisha, who became president. Berisha's government promised rapid reforms, privatization, market liberalization, integration with Europe, but transition is not a straight road. State industries were dismantled quickly, often without regulatory frameworks. Wealth accumulated unevenly. Corruption took root. The safety net that had existed under communism disappeared, but the prosperity of capitalism had not yet arrived. Many Albanians, after decades of isolation, dreamed of escape. In 1991 and 1992, thousands boarded overcrowded ships heading to Italy. Images of packed vessels crossing the Adriatic became iconic. Families risked everything for a chance at opportunity. This was not merely migration. It was release. The world that had been forbidden for generations suddenly lay open and uncertain. Then came 1997. If the fall of communism was the emotional climax of liberation, 1997 was the dark valley that followed. Throughout the mid-1990s, pyramid investment schemes spread across Albania, promising extraordinary returns. These schemes attracted money from hundreds of thousands of citizens, many investing life savings. Trust in institutions was fragile, oversight was weak. When the schemes collapsed in early 1997, financial devastation swept the country, savings vanished overnight, anger ignited, protests erupted across cities. Government buildings were attacked, military depots were looted, placing weapons into civilian hands. Law and order disintegrated in many regions. For a moment, Albania seemed on the brink of civil war. The state, still young and unstable, faltered. Armed groups controlled neighborhoods. Fear returned, not ideological this time, but anarchic. International intervention became necessary. A multinational force led by Italy deployed to stabilize the situation. Elections were held later that year, leading to political change. The crisis revealed painful truths. Democracy without strong institutions is vulnerable. Freedom without accountability can spiral. Transition requires more than replacing a regime, it requires building trust, yet even through chaos, something fundamental endured. Albanians did not retreat into dictatorship. Despite instability, the political system remained pluralistic. Power transferred through elections rather than permanent repression. The late 1990s brought another challenge beyond Albania's borders. In neighboring Kosovo, tensions between ethnic Albanians and Serbian authorities escalated into conflict. The Kosovo War of 1998 to 1999 sent hundreds of thousands of refugees into Albania. Camps filled rapidly, families hosted strangers, resources strained. Albania, still recovering from internal crisis, became a sanctuary. The NATO intervention against Serbian forces in 1999 reshaped the region. For Albanians, the conflict reinforced cross-border ethnic solidarity while also deepening geopolitical realignments. By the early 2000s, Albania began stabilizing more visibly, economic reforms matured gradually, infrastructure projects expanded, foreign investment increased modestly, political competition remained intense, but democratic mechanisms persisted. The bunkers still dotted the hills, silent reminders of isolation. But roads now connected regions more efficiently. Satellite dishes appeared on rooftops, symbols of openness unimaginable 2 decades earlier. The arc of this episode is turbulent: the fall of authoritarian control, the euphoria of freedom, the shock of economic collapse, the test of national resilience. The climax was not a single event but a series of reckonings: 1991's liberation, 1997's chaos, 1999's regional war. Through each, Albania confronted the same underlying question that had shaped its history for centuries: how does a small nation at the crossroads survive powerful currents without losing itself? In the 1990s, survival required adaptability once again, but this time in a globalized world. The eagle had broken free from its cage, but flying in open skies requires strength, balance, and direction. As the 21st century approached, Albania stood not as a sealed state nor as a monarchy nor as an imperial province, but as a fragile democracy learning, stumbling, and rising in real time. The walls had fallen, now the nation had to learn how to live without them. By the turn of the 21st century, Albania had emerged from the shadows of isolation and chaos into a world that was both full of opportunity and fraught with uncertainty. The eagle of Skanderbeg, once confined under empires, bunkers, and ideologies, now faced the wide expanse of modernity. Yet history had left deep marks. Decades of repression, civil strife, and economic upheaval had left the nation fragile, divided between hope and skepticism. The country's first challenge was institutional rebuilding. Decades of authoritarian rule had stripped governance of expertise and accountability. Ministries were staffed with inexperienced officials. Courts were weak. The police and security services were transforming from instruments of surveillance into instruments of public service. Reform required vision, patience, and political will. Albanian leaders realized that building institutions would take longer than any revolution, longer than the collapse of dictatorship or the chaos of 1997. Economic reform remained the lifeblood of the nation's transformation. The shift from a centrally planned, state-controlled system to a market economy was neither smooth nor linear. Factories that had been modernized under Italian, German, or communist plans often fell into decay, unable to compete in global markets. Agriculture, long the backbone of rural Albania, required modernization to survive. Privatization, once a promise of prosperity, created both opportunity and resentment. Entrepreneurs thrived, but wealth disparity widened. Corruption, rooted in centuries of fragmented authority and secrecy, remained a stubborn obstacle. Meanwhile, Albania's youth represented both challenge and hope. After decades of isolation, new generations had access to education, technology, and ideas from abroad. Universities, often struggling for resources, became incubators of thought, debate, and aspiration. Students traveled to Europe under exchange programs and returned carrying ideas about democracy, entrepreneurship, and civic responsibility. Language, the thread that had unified Albanians during the relinja of the 19th century, now became a bridge to the global economy. English, Italian, and other languages were embraced as tools of connection, while Albanian culture was increasingly promoted as a unique and marketable identity abroad. The 2000s also saw a concerted effort at European integration. The Albanian government sought recognition from international institutions and began implementing reforms to meet EU standards. Judicial independence, anti-corruption legislation, and human rights initiatives were placed at the center of policy. Membership in NATO in 2009 marked a symbolic and strategic triumph. Albania, once a cornered nation, now had a seat at the table of global security. It was an affirmation of sovereignty, but also a reminder of obligations. Integration required more than signing treaties, it demanded transformation of society itself. Social transformation, too, was profound. Cities like Tirana and Durrës became hubs of commerce, culture, and international exchange. Cafes buzzed with conversation, reminiscent of the gatherings in Prizren and Manastır over a century earlier, but now the topics were entrepreneurship, technology, art, and European identity. Yet, rural regions often lagged behind. The divide between mountains and plains, north and south, echoed centuries-old patterns of geography shaping autonomy. Development projects sought to bridge these gaps, but the persistence of old loyalties and economic patterns made change gradual. The legacy of the past lingered in political culture. Albania's political scene was polarized, often dominated by the Democratic Party and the Socialist Party, heirs in ideology and approach to the transitions of the 1990s. Each election cycle became a test not just of governance but of Albania's ability to reconcile divisions. Debates were heated, mistrust lingered from the decades of authoritarian control, civil unrest, and clan-based influence. Yet despite the volatility, the mechanism of democracy endured. Power changed hands peacefully, illustrating a profound shift from centuries of conquest, occupation, and dictatorship. During this period, Albania also confronted the challenges of emigration and diaspora. Millions of Albanians had left during the 1990s and early 2000s, seeking opportunity in Italy, Greece, the United States, and beyond. Remittances became a critical component of the economy, supporting families and businesses at home. At the same time, the diaspora preserved cultural memory and fostered international networks. Albanian communities abroad became a bridge, linking the nation to commerce, politics, and global ideas. Yet immigration also represented a loss. Young, educated Albanians often left, creating a brain drain that slowed domestic innovation. Cultural revival paralleled political and economic transformation. Albania's rich historical heritage, from the ruins of Apollonia and Butrin to the Ottoman-era towns of Gjirokastër and Berat, was increasingly recognized as both a national treasure and a tourist asset. Festivals celebrated music, dance, and literature. Folklore and oral history, once confined to villages and mountain paths, were digitized and disseminated worldwide. The double-headed eagle, a symbol carried from Skanderbeg to independence, now waved in modern contexts, sports, national ceremonies, and international events, linking past and present. Albania's international relationships, particularly with neighbors, were tested and strengthened simultaneously. Relations with Kosovo were critical. Kosovo's struggle for independence in the late 1990s had created waves of refugees and deep solidarity. Albania played a key role in providing humanitarian assistance, while also lobbying internationally for recognition of Kosovo's sovereignty. Relationships with Greece, Italy, Serbia, and Montenegro required diplomacy balancing historical tensions, ethnic claims, and modern economic partnerships. Albania was no longer isolated, it was fully integrated into regional geopolitics, with both opportunity and responsibility. Despite these strides, challenges persisted in governance, justice, and social cohesion. Corruption, remnants of old systems, continued to undermine confidence in state institutions. Regional disparities created tension between urban and rural populations. Clan influence, though diminished, occasionally surfaced in local politics. The legacy of Hoxha's paranoia, his monarchy, and the chaotic 1990s left cultural scars that would take generations to heal. Yet in every village, town, and city, a profound truth emerged: Albanians were no longer merely survivors. They were participants in their own destiny. The country that had endured Ottoman conquest, monarchy, fascist occupation, communist isolation, and civil unrest now faced the modern world with agency. It had learned resilience not from external protection, but from centuries of navigating adversity, mountains, empires, ideologies, and borders. The thematic arc of this episode is clear: Albania had moved from existence under duress to assertion of identity and freedom. The conflict of survival had shifted from defending territory or ideology to managing opportunity and modernization. The eagle, once trapped under empires and bunkers, now soared through corridors of governance, streets of thriving cities, and bridges to Europe, yet the flight was cautious. Modernity demanded adaptation, vigilance, and collaboration. Albania had learned through centuries that freedom is not a single event, it is a continuous effort. Institutions, civic engagement, economic development, cultural revival, and diplomacy all became instruments to preserve that freedom. As the 21st century advanced, Albania faced both external pressures and internal demands. The nation was small, geographically and economically, but rich in history, culture, and resilience. It had inherited a narrative of survival and resistance. From Skanderbeg to the national awakening, from monarchy to communist isolation, from civil chaos to democracy, every challenge had reinforced the importance of unity, identity, and adaptability. In this chapter of Albania's story, the nation had transitioned from the fragile shadow of history to a self-aware, active participant on the world stage. The eagle was free, but it now needed vision, strategy, and collective determination to navigate the complex skies ahead. The climax of this era was not dramatic in cannon fire or conquest, it was the emergence of agency. After centuries of being ruled, occupied, or constrained, Albania now ruled itself, negotiated its destiny, and engaged with the world. The challenge now was subtle but profound. Could a nation shaped by centuries of adversity transform that history into sustainable prosperity, unity, and identity in the modern age? Albania had endured. Albania had survived. And Albania was beginning to define what it meant to thrive. As the first decades of the 21st century unfolded, Albania entered a period defined less by survival and conquest and more by negotiation with itself. Centuries of history had produced a nation accustomed to external pressures: Ottoman conquest, monarchy, fascist occupation, communist isolation, but now the challenge was internal: how to transform a society shaped by resilience into one capable of modern prosperity, civic cohesion, and cultural confidence. The tension was everywhere. Cities like Tirana expanded rapidly. Streets once lined with small cafes and Ottoman-era buildings gave way to modern high-rises, shopping centers, and international chains. The skyline, bright with neon and satellite dishes, symbolized Albania's desire to join the global economy. But outside urban centers, especially in the north and the mountainous east, life often remained anchored in centuries-old traditions. Villages still operated under informal networks, where family, clan ties, and local customs governed social life more than government regulations. This duality, modern urban ambition versus enduring traditional structures, defined Albanian identity in this period. Governance, law, and economy followed one set of rules. Social expectations, marriage customs, and interpersonal loyalty followed another. Politicians, social planners, and educators faced the delicate task of bridging these worlds without alienating either side. The political landscape remained highly polarized. Two major parties, the Socialist Party and the Democratic Party, dominated discourse, alternating in government while continuously vying for influence. While formal democracy had taken root after 1991, political life often resembled a continuation of historical struggles. Factions, rivalries, and local loyalties shaped national decisions. Elections became both a measure of public will and a test of Albania's resilience in balancing regional, ideological, and historical divides. Economically, Albania was simultaneously growing and fragile. Remittances from the diaspora remained a lifeline, while tourism became a vital industry. The Adriatic and Ionian coasts, as well as historic towns like Berat and Gjirokastër, drew international visitors, linking Albania to the global economy. Yet the informal economy thrived alongside official institutions, a legacy of both the communist era and the chaotic 1990s. Jobs, opportunities, and modern infrastructure were unevenly distributed, creating tension between urban centers and rural regions. Education became a central battlefield for the nation's future. Schools and universities emphasized not only technical and professional skills but also civic literacy, history, and identity. Students were taught about Skanderbeg, the League of Prizren, independence, and the Albanian national awakening alongside global history, democracy, and market economies. The challenge was to create citizens grounded in tradition but prepared for global engagement. Language, once the central unifying thread, now became a tool for innovation, international collaboration, and cultural export. English, Italian, and other languages flourished alongside Albanian, enabling a younger generation to participate fully in global discourse. At the same time, Albania confronted social and demographic challenges. Migration continued as youth sought opportunities abroad, creating a tension between brain drain and global networks. Families relied on remittances while facing the cultural and emotional strain of separation. Rural depopulation accelerated, leaving villages with elderly populations and undermining traditional knowledge networks. Yet these same patterns also created connections to the broader Albanian diaspora, ensuring that cultural memory and national identity remained vibrant worldwide. The country also faced regional and international pressures. Kosovo's independence in 2008 created both solidarity and tension, as cross-border ties demanded careful diplomacy. Relations with Greece, Italy, Montenegro, and Serbia required navigating historical grievances while fostering cooperation. Albania sought integration with the European Union, adopting reforms in governance, justice, and human rights, even as internal divisions slowed the process. NATO membership, achieved in 2009, offered security and strategic partnerships but also required balancing sovereignty with international obligations. Culturally, Albania experienced a renaissance. Music, film, literature, and digital media flourished. Traditional festivals and folklore were revived, not as museum pieces, but as living parts of society. The nation began to reconcile centuries of layered history, Skanderbeg, Ottoman legacies, independence movements, monarchy, fascism, communism with contemporary identity. Museums, cultural centers, and restored historical sites preserved memory while creating spaces for dialogue about the future. The eagle on the flag, the centuries-old symbol of Albanian resilience, now represented continuity in the midst of rapid change, yet beneath progress, tension persisted. Corruption and political factionalism challenged state authority. Organized crime, often a vestige of historical informal networks, undermined law and public trust. Public services struggled to meet rising expectations. Infrastructural development lagged behind ambition. Climate events, including floods and droughts, exposed vulnerabilities in both planning and resource allocation. Despite these challenges, Albania's national identity proved resilient. Centuries of adapting to empire, monarchy, occupation, isolation, and transition had produced a population capable of endurance and reinvention. Civil society organizations multiplied, addressing environmental protection, social inclusion, education, and women's rights. Youth movements became influential, advocating both reform and cultural preservation. The country's narrative, once dominated by foreign domination and internal strife, shifted toward agency, self-determination, and global engagement. The thematic core of this episode is negotiation between past and future. Albanians were learning to integrate centuries-old traditions with the demands of modernity. Clan loyalty and regional identity, once primary forces, now had to coexist with civic identity, constitutional law, and market economy principles. Religion, banned under communist rule and now legally permitted, became a personal choice rather than a political instrument. The canon persisted in cultural memory, but its legal authority diminished. This balance between continuity and change became central to Albania's national narrative. The climax of this era is subtle but profound. It is not a battle or revolution but the steady assertion of agency and self-definition. Albania, small geographically yet historically vast in experience, faced the task of shaping its destiny without the guidance or oppression of empires, ideologies, or external powers. Every choice, from governance to education, from economic policy to cultural preservation, became part of an ongoing story, how a nation built on centuries of struggle navigates the complexities of modern existence. By the 2010s, Albania had achieved a remarkable transformation. Its cities were vibrant, its population increasingly mobile and educated, and its international partnerships expanding. Yet the nation remained attentive to its history, conscious of the resilience forged under adversity, and aware that stability required constant vigilance, civic engagement, and adaptability. The eagle had not only survived centuries of conquest, oppression, and isolation, it was learning to soar in a new sky, one defined not by fear but by the challenge of choice, responsibility, and vision. Albania had moved from survival to agency, from isolation to participation, from inherited identity to consciously constructed nationhood. But the journey was ongoing. The question now was not whether Albania could endure, it had proven that. The question was whether it could thrive, balancing tradition and innovation, memory and aspiration, past and future. By the second decade of the 21st century, Albania had traversed a path few nations could claim. From the valleys of the Ottoman-era, through the turbulence of independence, monarchy, fascist occupation, communist isolation, and democratic rebirth, the nation now faced the ultimate challenge, consolidating its identity, sovereignty, and place in a rapidly globalizing world. The modern Albanian state had matured institutionally, though the journey was ongoing. Courts functioned independently, elections were competitive, and civic engagement had become a cornerstone of governance. Citizens, especially the youth, increasingly demanded accountability, transparency, and meritocracy. Political pluralism was no longer theoretical. It was daily practice, often messy and contentious, but undeniably alive. Economically, Albania had begun integrating into regional and global markets. Tourism flourished along the Adriatic and Ionian coasts. Ancient cities like Berat and Gjirokastër attracted international visitors, blending UNESCO heritage with local culture. Agriculture, modernized with EU-inspired reforms, became more productive, while small and medium enterprises generated employment and innovation. Yet challenges remained. Unemployment, emigration, and economic disparity between urban and rural regions continued to test the state's capacity to deliver equitable growth. Social transformation reflected Albania's resilience and creativity. Generations raised under communism or through the chaotic 1990s now navigated a society of choice and opportunity. Women assumed leadership roles in politics, business, and education, reflecting a profound cultural shift. Universities expanded, research flourished, and technology hubs emerged in Tirana, Durrës, and Shkodër. The digital revolution connected Albanians at home and abroad, turning the diaspora into active participants in national development. Internationally, Albania achieved milestones that earlier generations could hardly imagine. NATO membership solidified security, while the path to EU accession guided reform and modernization. Diplomatic engagement strengthened ties with neighbors Kosovo, Montenegro, Greece, and Italy, balancing historical grievances with contemporary cooperation. Regional stability became both a strategic necessity and a moral imperative, yet the defining feature of modern Albania was identity forged in adversity. Centuries of struggle, defending territory, asserting autonomy, resisting foreign domination had instilled resilience. Cultural revivals celebrated this history. Literature, music, film, and visual arts reflected a dialogue between past and present. National heroes like Skanderbeg and figures from the Albanian national awakening were not relics but living symbols, connecting citizens to a lineage of resistance, unity, and creativity. Challenges persisted in governance and society. Corruption, uneven judicial enforcement, and entrenched patronage networks occasionally undermined reform. Emigration continued to sap talent, yet the diaspora remained an indispensable partner in development. Rural depopulation, urban congestion, and regional disparities reminded leaders that progress was uneven. History's lessons, however, shaped solutions. Pragmatism, local engagement, and collective resilience were prioritized alongside modernization. Education became the heart of Albania's future. Schools emphasized not just technical knowledge but civic literacy, history, and global awareness. Students were taught how to navigate a world that demanded innovation while preserving identity. Language remained a unifying thread. Albanian connected citizens, while foreign languages opened doors to trade, culture, and international collaboration. Culturally, Albania balanced heritage and modernity with grace. Traditional festivals thrived alongside contemporary arts. Music, literature, and theater reflected the tensions and triumphs of a society negotiating continuity with change. National symbols, the eagle, the flag, the narrative of resistance, were both honored and reinterpreted in modern contexts, linking past struggles to present aspirations. By the 2020s, Albania had become a nation defined not by its vulnerabilities but by its agency and adaptability. It had survived empires, dictatorship, war, and economic collapse. It had reasserted sovereignty, nurtured democracy, and cultivated global partnerships. Its citizens, now connected to the world yet grounded in their history, understood that freedom was not merely a political condition, it was an ongoing practice, requiring vigilance, participation, and vision. The thematic arc of this final chapter is profound. Albania transformed adversity into identity, survival into opportunity, and historical consciousness into modern agency. The nation's story illustrates that resilience is not passive endurance but active engagement with history, society, and the future. The eagle, once caged by foreign empires, ideologies, and isolation, now soars confidently yet attentively across a horizon shaped by both memory and aspiration. Albania's journey is not complete. Like all nations, it continues to evolve. But the lessons of the past, unity, perseverance, and strategic adaptability, provide both compass and courage. Today, Albania is a testament to the human capacity to endure, reinvent, and thrive. From the Relinja to independence, from monarchy to communism, from isolation to global integration, every chapter reinforced a single truth: a nation that knows its history can shape its future. And now, as we reflect on this remarkable journey through centuries of struggle, triumph, and transformation, remember, the story of Albania continues with every citizen, every act of civic responsibility, and every moment of cultural pride. If you enjoyed this journey through Albanian history, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the like button to support more in-depth stories like this. Your support helps keep history alive and accessible to everyone.